everyone. I'm happy to welcome you here on our traditional Wednesday lectures. And I'm very honored to introduce you our today's speaker, Mihal Muravski. Mihal is an anthropologist of architecture, and he's from Poland, and he's a research fellow of the Department of Russian at St. Mary
Queen Mary.
Queen, sorry, Queen Mary University of London.
She only died like 50 years ago, so she's not
Yeah,
safe.
that's why he's he knows Russian very good. But the lecture are going to be in English. And since this year, Michal is a research fellow at Graduate School of Urbanism, and he's going to make research on the territory of Zaryadye Park and to hold a workshop with the students of Graduate School of Urbanism. And I think Michal will talk a little bit more about it. So please start lecture.
Okay. Do you know how to make it full как сделать полный просмотр? Только это как бы не хочет пойти в этом движении, в котором я. Окей, отлично, спасибо. Ну да, но буду говорить по-английски, потому что я как бы думаю, что недостаточно говорю о этих вещах, о которых буду говорить сейчас, чтобы по-русски проводить эту лекцию. Но the plan is so that it's not a lecture, but more of a discussion. Спасибо. And it's more of a kind of, I'm just laying out some ideas behind my research and my methodological approach to research, and the hope is that these ideas will inform the workshops that I will carry out together with Sasha Strepetov, I think, at your department next year. Well, soon in October. I know it's not Sasha Strepetov, but that's why I'm saying I think. Sasha Strepetov, who is around somewhere. So we will be conducting these workshops from October, and I think they'll be announced towards the end of the week. And the workshops будут по-русски, конечно, но так будет немножко по-русски, немножко по-английски. They'll be in both languages, but just for now, so that it's easier, I will speak in English. So I understand that every year you have several workshops on various themes, and they will start in October and then continue until kind of April and end in some sort of experimental project that we hope that the students who take part in the workshop will conduct. So the project will focus on Zaryadye Park, but also perhaps will consider other parts of Moscow too. So the idea is now for me to talk about my research in Warsaw, and to give you some insight into how I think about what urban ethnographic methodology is. And then to pose the question at the end of how one might use some of these ideas or critique some of these ideas or whatever in the context of Moscow. So how can we think about experimenting with how to conduct ethnographic research in Warsaw, in Moscow, because we're in Moscow now. So the idea is that I mean with this these ideas and the experiments, the sort of ethnographic methodological experiments that I carried out in Warsaw during my previous research projects were informed by this idea called ethnographic conceptualism, which is an idea that Nikolai Ssoriin-Chajkov, who's an anthropologist who's also at Wyszka in Peter, he's starting a new sort of anthropology program at the History Cathedra in St. Petersburg. So he coined this notion of ethnographic conceptualism to refer to quote him, conducting ethnography as conceptual art, and conversely conducting conceptual art as ethnography. So how can we use some ideas from conceptual art to inform our ethnographic practice and our research, and then how perhaps can we think about turning some of our ethnography and the products that come out of this ethnography into a kind of artwork. And also how to engage ethnographically, not only with other anthropologists or with other academics, but also engaging with a broader audience. So in a way, this sort of public library is a very suitable place to talk about this kind of public engagement, but not purely with a broader audience, but also the at least in Nikolai's conception, the idea is to treat the audience of your fieldwork in a similar way to how the artist or a curator might treat the audience of a work of art. So very much the idea of engaging with an audience on a level beyond that of the traditional ethnographic understanding and beyond an academic understanding, and also perhaps to provoke your audience a little bit, and also and the key point that I was trying to sort of that I momentarily overlooked is that the whole point here is that we're trying to break down the division between the academic audience and the informants that you interact with during fieldwork. So traditionally, and to a large extent still today, a social anthropologist or a cultural anthropologist spends time in the field with the natives, and then they finish there and they gather data from the natives, and then they go home and then they write up the results of the data and they present the results of their data to other academics, to like 5 other academics who will read their work and nobody else, and write up the results of the ethnographic fieldwork in isolation from the actual informants, from the natives who provided the data. So the idea is here that you merge the academic audience with the informants, and you treat both the academics and the informants as something other than what they are. So more as a kind of unified audience, so there's various different ways about going about that. And the key point here is that you present, while you're collecting your data from your natives, you present your data to them while you're in the process of collecting it. So you try to provoke their comment and also their validation and their own opinions on the data you're gathering while you're conducting your research. So I first started looking at this kind of stuff when I was working on the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, which was a Stalinist skyscraper built between 1952 and 1955 as Stalin's gift to the Polish nation. It's very much a cousin of the Wysocki in Moscow. Designed. Does anyone know who designed this building? Anyone know who designed MGU? Very old. Rudniew, yeah. Did you say Rudniew? Yes, you did. Okay, I heard you saying it even if you didn't say it. So this was designed by Lev Rudniew, who's the same person who designed MGU, designed by Moscow architects, built by Soviet laborers in the center of Warsaw. So the Palace of Culture is not only, this is what it looks like. Oh, there's supposed to be some more pictures here, never mind. This is what it looks like superimposed onto, this is what it looks like on a Google Earth image in Warsaw today. So it's not only tall, but it's also very wide and sprawling. Its side wings reach out like sort of talons into the surrounding emptiness. And it's not only huge, but also aesthetically it's very spectacular. A sort of a fairly extreme incarnation of Stalinist socialist realist or Stalinsky Empire style architecture, and it looks even crazier because in Moscow, I suppose, there's lots of these guys, but in Warsaw, it looks particularly sort of obscene and extreme and kind of out of place because there are a few other Stalinist buildings, but there's nothing quite like this. So it sort of towers over the city of Warsaw and looks completely sort of alien and bizarre and imposing and dominant, etc. But the key thing about the palace and what distinguishes and makes the palace more interesting, in my opinion, than any of the Moscow Wysocki is that it contains so many different functions. Most of the Moscowski Wysocki contain one university with some functions within the university, or a residential block, or some offices, or a mixture of residential and offices. Whereas the Warsaw Palace contains this unbelievable mixture of different kinds of functions. So it contains 4 theatres. This is the Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones playing at a concert in the Palace of Culture in 1967. So in the same room that the Communist Party used to hold their their congresses, the Rolling Stones also played a concert. It contains 4 theatres, several art galleries. This is another one of the theatres, a multiplex cinema, 2 universities, a 3,000-seat Congress hall. This is a museum of. This is a part of the Palace of Youth, which is this huge. You have these Dvorec Молодежи or something, no? In Moscow too. Dvorec. Что? Как? Что? Yeah, Dvorec Pionierów, yeah. But there isn't a term like Dvorec Молодежи or Dvorec Юности.
Yes.
Yeah.
Palace of Youth.
Yeah, but does this term exist in Russian? Yeah. Well, anyway, I suppose the Dvorec Pionierów is the closest example, equivalent example. It has this huge marble swimming pool. It has the headquarters of the Warsaw City Assembly. Has a museum of technology, which is sort of mostly geared at children, but not exclusively. It has this viewing terrace on the 30th floor, where you can enjoy the panorama of Warsaw, and which is a sort of popular suicide spot, like the bridge in the Zaradie Park. But also a popular dating spot. So it's a very sort of romantic place to take your date, and it features in television programs as a dating spot, etc., etc. Has the headquarters of the city council, so the Duma of Warsaw meets in the palace. It has nightclubs housed in former kind of Communist Party headquarters. The Polish Academy of Sciences also has its headquarters in the palace. So it has this incredible diversity of various different kinds of functions within the building. And yeah, so this is the point. Sort of, it very much rides roughshod over the city structure of Warsaw. So this is an image of the Palace of Culture, a digital image superimposed onto a satellite, onto an aerial photograph of Warsaw in 1935. As you can see, this was a very sort of densely packed network of tenement blocks, nearly all of which were destroyed or at least heavily damaged after the war, and then the remainders of all of these tenement blocks were demolished to make way for the Palace of Culture, and it's now surrounded by this vast empty area. In the 90s and 2000s, this vast empty area was empty, but it was filled with this huge bazaar, with this huge rynok, with this sort of very chaotic marketplace with traders from all over the world selling their goods. They were removed, and now the area around it has been completely empty since 1989. Despite various ideas to fill it with skyscrapers and with a money-making city centre, and a museum of modern art, all of these ideas have failed, and the palace continues to sort of dominate over the city as it did, or in a sense even more than it did under communism. So to talk about some of these experiments with methodology, I'll describe how some of these methodological experiments combined some sort of traditional ethnographic fieldwork, so face-to-face participant observation. I suppose this term also can be translated into Russian somehow, but this idea that you not only observe what's going on in the setting in which you do fieldwork, but you also participate in the daily life of that setting. What Bronisław Malinowski, the Polish-British anthropologist, described as immersion, what Clifford Geertz described as thick description. So I combine these sort of traditional methods with kinds of interventions, with ethnographic interventions into public debates related to architecture and planning, but also with a large-scale quantitative survey of 5,000 informants, which I carried out towards the end of my research, which was designed to test the hypotheses I had developed earlier on a sort of clearly defined sample of informants. So the idea is that it combines sort of old-fashioned ethnographic, very sort of face-to-face methodology with some sort of weird artistic conceptual interventions, and also with this kind of rather sort of quantitative type of survey. And the point is that this the combination of these 3 data gathering techniques mirrored the kind of huge scale, bombastic aesthetic, and broad social reach the palace. And so I refer to the methodology I developed as palaceology. So in a way, I'm kind of suggesting that the methodology was similar to the palace. It kind of impersonated the way the palace functioned in the city of Warsaw. I'll skip over to some of the sort of theoretical blah 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 here, because if you take part in the workshop, you'll have to read the article anyway. So I'll leave that for later. But the idea is here that this methodology, this method kind of mimics the kind of totalitarian presence of the palace in lots of different aspects of Warsaw's social life. So it sort of carries into the life of Warsaw some of the attitudes of the planners, the kind of totalizing, holistic attitudes of the planners who built Warsaw after 1945, who rebuilt Warsaw from the ruins after 1945, and who desired to make the Palace of Culture into this kind of dominating into this sort of dominating building, which was supposed to subordinate the entire city to itself. And also, I mean, there's also a relationship here. I'm going to skip over a lot of this because I want to have more time to talk about Moscow. But the idea is that there is a relationship here with the anthropological idea of the gift. So if some of you have some research in a background in anthropology, this sort of Marcel Mauss is the sort of this kind of founder of the idea of the gift as a total social fact. So when you so according to Mauss, certain societies operated on the basis of a gift-giving economy rather than of a commodities economy. So when you give someone, or when a gift functions in this sort of very totalizing way in a society, in a capitalist or a modern society where you have these different spheres of life, where social life and economic life and juridical life is divided into different spheres, the gift doesn't penetrate. If you give someone a gift for Christmas, it doesn't penetrate into every sphere of life. Whereas in a society based on the gift is economic, it's aesthetic, it's juridical, it's social, it's political, it's everything at the same time. So this is a kind of traditional anthropological distinction between a society based on the gift and a society based on the commodity. And certain scholars have argued, and Nikolai Ssori'n-Chaykov has argued this, and I sort of developed some of these ideas, that state socialism, communism as it was implemented in the Soviet Union, but also in the Eastern European countries, tried to formulate, whereas the Maussian gift was a pre-modern gift society, communism tried to sort of abolish the commodity society and create a kind of modern sort of gift society. And in a sense, so a gift society which is as totalizing and which also breaks down the separation between these different areas of social life, but does it in a very contemporary, in a very radical, in a revolutionary way as well. So in a sense, the revolutionary impact of state socialism on the economy is very closely connected to some ideas about the gift. And the Palace of Culture, which was very aggressively described as a gift from the Soviet Union, is the clearest incarnation of this kind of gift functioning in a society. So. I mean, the other key point to Mauss's idea of the gift is that there is this notion that once you received a key idea in Mauss's theory is the idea of the obligation to reciprocate. So you never receive a free gift; you always have to give something back. And the more someone emphasizes that you don't have to give anything back, and that this is purely their hospitality, and this is your free gift, so just enjoy it, the more in control of you they are. So actually the more power they have over you, and the more subtly you have to repay that gift to the giver. So when the Palace of Culture was gifted to Warsaw, the newspapers, politicians kept emphasizing sort of madly how this is the first time ever that one nation has given a free gift to another nation, which will not have to be paid back in any way whatsoever. Never before in the annals of diplomacy has one nation received such a free gift, etc., etc. And obviously this was utter nonsense, because the Palace of Culture was this sort of dominating, sort of monstrous colonial entity, which totally and utterly rode roughshod over the traditional structure of Warsaw and symbolized the sort of Soviet, the imposition of Soviet political control over Poland. And this is definitely, it's more complicated now, obviously, because also there were a lot of, communism emerged from a lot of complex geopolitical considerations, and there were a lot of Polish communists. But the point is that after 1989, when Poland stopped being communist, especially after 1981, when the Soviet Union fell, and after 1993, when the last Russian soldiers left Poland, this obligation to reciprocate was no longer there, because the person who gave the gift, the Russia, the Soviet Union, no longer, well, the Soviet Union, the giver ceased to exist. But this infrastructure of totality that the gift introduced into Warsaw continued to exist. So you no longer had to reciprocate anybody, but the Palace of Culture was still there, and it was still involved in every single aspect of social life. So you could still go to the theatre there, you could go swimming there, you could go to the municipal assembly there, you could go to the library there, you could go to university there, you could go and meet your lover there, you could go kill yourself there. It still existed in this sort of very totalizing way, in this sort of gift-like way, without the obligation to reciprocate. So in a way, that's what lies behind the fact that it dominates over the city even more than it used to, but it's no longer hated in the same way that it once was. So that's a very complicated summary of this idea of the gift. But again, this is something that we can discuss in more detail later. But what I was trying to do basically is to play with this totality, is to play with this presence of the Palace of Culture in so many different parts of the city's social life, and also to explore the way in which people in Warsaw were fascinated by the Palace of Culture. So people in Warsaw had very strong affection for the palace. Some people really hated it, some people loved it, some people wanted to marry it, some people wrote letters to the Palace of Culture, asking it for help in various aspects of their lives, etc., etc. People tattoo the Palace of Culture onto their bodies. They wear T-shirts with the Palace of Culture on it. All of these kinds of things. So there is this kind of total presence of the Palace of Culture in Warsaw's social life, which needed a sort of experimental methods to explore. And this is also related to this anthropological holism. So basically now, what I did, so this is a problem with trying to not read, because then I just sort of say all of the things that I had written down. But maybe that'll mean that it will take less time. So just some slides, basically, sort of emphasis. This is actually from a book from 1956 by a Polish Stalinist, an ideologue of Stalinist architecture called Edmund Goldzampt, who very much was a figure who worked and lived between Moscow and Warsaw. He taught at Marchi, but also at the Warsaw Polytechnic at the same time. And these are drawings he had commissioned. The first one is of Moscow organized around the Palace of the Soviets, around the Dworcel, which was never built. And you can see that these Moskovskie Vysotki are organized around the Palace of the Soviets, which never came to exist. Whereas the bottom one is by the same artist, but it shows Warsaw organized around the Palace of Culture. So in a way, the Palace of Culture functions in Warsaw in the same way that, so this is the Palace of Culture and this is Warsaw, with the historical section of Warsaw foregrounded a little bit more, whereas this is Moscow organized around the Palace of the Soviets. So the idea is that the Palace of Culture functions in the same way as the Palace of the Soviets was supposed to function in Moscow. So as opposed to all of the Vysotki, which have one function, the Palace of Soviets has many functions. In the same way that the Palace of Culture has many functions and constitutes kind of the absolute center of the city. And you can see this sort of centrality here. And I don't know how we got onto these parts. Oh yeah, so there's also the importance of this fascination with numbers of with the sort of quantitative expression of the palace's absolute enormity. So there was this kind of statistical after the Palace of Culture opened, but also since then, really, throughout the Palace of Culture's long existence in Warsaw, when you read a sort of a newspaper article about the palace, it always starts by expressing how big the palace is, with this kind of endless quantity of numbers. So you're supposed to be impressed by these unimaginably huge numbers, and thereby to be stunned by the enormity of the palace, and that's supposed to sort of explain its kind of sublime enormity. So, for example, the first sort of big news story, reportage, big sort of news article about the Palace of Culture published in 1991 after the fall of communism started with the following lines. The Palace of Culture occupies 3.3 hectares of space. Its height is 230.68 meters. Its 42 floors are served by 33 elevators, traveling at speeds between 1 and 6 meters per second. The palace contains 3,288 rooms. There we go. Among them 15 large halls devoted to hosting exhibitions and conferences. The biggest of these, the Congress Hall, has 2,915 spaces for spectators. Simultaneous translation facilities in 8 languages, 52 seats on the Presidium, a 36-meter wide stage, 14 cloakrooms able to accommodate a total of 560 or 5,600 people. Between 1955 and the end of 1990, 147 million people have taken part in 221,000 events within the palace. 33 million tourists have viewed the panorama of Warsaw from the 30th floor viewing terrace. Every day, 30,000 people pass through the palace. So there is this kind of diarrhea of numbers that is connected to the Palace of Culture, and this was sort of this was a theme throughout the way in which people apprehend or think about the palace throughout its existence, and it was also what inspired the idea of doing a survey, of trying to express this unquantifiable enormity of the palace through an even greater quantity of figures. And a survey is very much so. I mean, anthropologists don't like surveys. They don't like statistics. They think that statistics reduce the complexity of social life. That they're vulgar. That they're modernist. That they're kind of totalitarian and evil and these kinds of things. So you don't often find anthropologists doing quantitative research. But I thought that in the case of this building, it seemed like it would be a good idea to try and grasp this kind of Kantian sort of quantitative sublime of the palace with some numbers. And this other, I mean, the other idea is this. Well, I mean, I'll skip over the Gesamtkunstwerk bit, but the other inspiration is this is the work of various sort of conceptual artists in both the Soviet Union and Poland, especially this, in the late 70s and 80s. You know, these conceptual artists who in sort of Boris Groys's classic analysis of the work of the Moscow conceptualists. You've probably come across Boris Groys in some form, like 100 times, in some form or other in your work. But in Groys's analysis, the Moscow conceptualists of Komar and Melamid and people like that, they took Stalin's projects, they took the forms and the symmetries and the aesthetics of Stalinism, and in a way, in their various experiments with these Stalinist forms, they developed them and actually sort of and completed them while at the same time sort of satirizing them without necessarily undermining them. So there's this, and Polish artists of the same period. So this is that. The first one was Komar, and these are both Komar and Melamid, I think. This is Lenin's Mausoleum, of course, where you have artists kind of seizing and sort of in a way which is it's sort of Stjob-like way. You can't really tell whether it's truly satirical or whether it's not satirical. Sort of playing with this totality and playing with the kind of symmetry. And you had Polish artists of the period doing the same sort of thing with the sort of symbols and with the legacies of Stalinist architecture and aesthetics and cityscapes. The most famous, among the most famous of these is Zofia Kulik, who is this sort of feminist Polish, largely a collage artist, but she also did loads of other things. And she was fascinated by the palace. And also by the phallicness of the palace and by the sort of perceived kind of domination of the palace, and embarked on all of these projects, of which only one. Sorry, I've only got one slide here. But she simultaneously appropriated the palace. So she sort of made the palace. She very much kind of very much sort of tamed this absurd dominance of the palace, but also understood it, I think, better than many other people. So there was something in the 70s and 80s in this sort of conceptual art wave throughout Eastern Europe, which reverted back to these Stalinist forms that especially artists in Poland and people, the society, Polish society in general, was trying to forget. So people in Poland weren't very keen to remember Stalinism. It was considered to be a very sort of negative epoch. The 60s and 70s in sort of official Polish cultural life and political life were all about negating the Stalinist period in history. Whereas you had these artists, but also satirists, authors, novelists in the 70s who were going back to these symbols of authoritarianism, of totalitarianism, of Stalinism, and trying to explore them in various kinds of rather counterintuitive ways, and especially the Palace of Culture. So in Poland, because the Palace of Culture was by far the most obvious symbol of Stalinism. Nothing else in Poland came even closer, came close to being as sort of vast and dominating as the palace. So the Palace of Culture was particularly central to sort of satirical artistic life in Poland in the 70s and 80s. So so basically, when all of this kind of terrified me when I first arrived in Warsaw for my fieldwork, and I was like, oh my God, the palace is everywhere and everyone's obsessed with it and it's too big and it's freaking me out and I can see it from my window and everyone wants to meet me there. So I was very cautious to not focus my research project on the Palace of Culture. So I spent the first few months of my fieldwork, this was my PhD fieldwork in Warsaw, ignoring the palace. So desperately trying to find a different subject to do my research about. It was too obvious. It was too banal in its enormity. It dominated over the city too much. It was used by too many thousands of people. It was sort of subverted and appropriated in too many ways. And in the end, so I tried to. People in Warsaw, I should have mentioned this before, but people in Warsaw talk about suffering from a palace complex. So, like in the palace complex, in the sort of Freudian sense, especially architects talk about how they are not able to build up the surroundings of the Palace of Culture, and, for example, build a building taller than the Palace of Culture. So Warsaw's been trying to build a bigger skyscraper than the Palace of Culture for 27 years, but so far it's been unable to build this bigger skyscraper. And so architects and municipal politicians joke among themselves that this is because they suffer from a palace complex. And so I was terrified of this palace complex, and I didn't want to sort of succumb to this palace complex myself. So I decided I was going to ignore the palace. And then in the end, I decided that actually the only way of dealing with the palace complex is to completely subordinate myself to the palace. And so I decided to try to do this research in the Palace of Culture, but try to do it in a way which sort of mirrored this kind of publicness and dominance of the Palace of Culture in Warsaw cityscape. So on one side, I employed myself as like a stagiaire in the administration body of the Palace of Culture. So this municipal agency that runs the Palace of Culture, and I got a little ID card, and I was able to explore the building as much as I liked, and I had a desk on the 15th floor. It took me a long time to negotiate that, but on one hand I became a sort of normal employee of the palace, with no actual functions, and obviously no salary, and then on the other so in this way I was trying to do this kind of participant observation of the sort that Bronisław Malinowski was doing 100 years before in Papua New Guinea, but in the context of this Stalinist skyscraper in Warsaw. And I was sort of talking to employees, and I went swimming in the swimming pool every Monday, and went to see films there, and went to see every single theatre show that I could see, only met people in the Palace of Culture, etc., and just sort of sat there and kind of explored its nooks and crannies. But on the other hand, eventually I realized that actually it was more interesting. The Palace of Culture was much more interesting as a building outside itself, within the city, than it was as a building within. So it had this very charismatic, charming life within, which visually very appealing, etc. But actually, its dominance within the city was more interesting than its life inside. So I decided to kind of become a public anthropologist in order to sort of mirror the way in which the palace was a public building. And this is where the sort of ethnographic conceptualism comes in. Oh, so these are again slightly randomly placed slides of various. These are people in the Palace of Youth celebrating the Palace of Youth's 55th birthday. This is Zofia Kulik again. These are children wearing clothes, decorated Palace of Culture. This is a person with a tattoo. This is lots of advertising in Warsaw uses the Palace of Culture. These are so completely random. These pictures for some reason, but never mind. So these are newspaper covers, like magazine covers with the Palace of Culture on them. Bizarrely, in 2012 there was this Mayan apocalypse that the world was going to end, and most of the major Polish news magazines chose to illustrate the stories about the end of the world with like collages of the Palace of Culture collapsing, which was so the koniec ery człowieka, no to понятно, mir kończyć się, apocalypse. The apocalypse will happen 70 million times. Also, this is an anti-Semitic magazine with the Palace of Culture. It's actually not. It's a sort of ordinary magazine which had a bizarrely anti-Semitic sort of cover of two Jews talking to themselves, saying, "Son, one day this will all be yours." And this is a very unpleasant reference to property restitution. So Warsaw before the war was a very especially that section of Warsaw had a very large Jewish population, and there is this fear in Poland that Jews will come back and take all their land. And take all their property back, and that Poland will be led into ruin by the Jews who will be coming to take their property back. So the Palace of Culture also figures in these sort of bizarre anti-Semitic discourses as well. Oh, and these are slides which show what I was talking about before. So these are the ideas that have been in circulation since 1989 surrounding the Palace of Culture with taller skyscrapers. So the first idea was to build a ring of skyscrapers around the palace. Was to sort of the idea was that if you surround the Palace of Culture with a crown of skyscrapers, this will somehow decrease its domination over Warsaw. So these are successive versions of the sort of crown. Until then, in 2007, it was decided that actually this was ridiculous, and if you build a crown around a palace, in fact, it will only increase its domination. So the idea was made to decenter the palace by surrounding it with a sort of asymmetrical forest of some tall buildings, a bit of park, some low buildings, and a museum of modern art on the right, and then this other L-shaped building to the right of it. And this developed by 2009, 2010 into this, which is the current vision for what's going to happen to the area around the Palace of Culture, which is of course none of this has been realized, even though the plan has already been in existence for 8 years. And then even so, the point is that this is this kind of asymmetrical vision of the Palace of Culture, which is lost in this kind of jungle of skyscrapers. What people sort of didn't realize is that if the Palace of Culture was the kind of drop on its side, it would fit like a block of Tetris into this kind of new public square. So this public square is it's referred to as the Agora, and it's supposed to be this democratic space where people forget that there was ever the Soviet Union, and they talk about democracy, and they drink flat whites or cappuccinos, and they talk about conceptual art, but in an apolitical way. So this was a sort of a socialist, apolitical space, which actually is simply a materialization of this sort of shadow of the Palace of Culture. So throughout in the 80s, in the 90s, especially in the 70s and 80s, there was a very common representation of kind of communist dominance over Poland was this photograph taken from the 30th floor viewing platform of the shadow of the palace falling over Warsaw, pointing east towards Moscow, obviously. And effectively, this new kind of asymmetrical plan is a sort of materialization of this sort of Moscow shadow of the palace. These are some men discussing. Normally, it's men discussing like what to do with the palace at a sort of public meeting. So this is a public meeting about the future of the palace held within the palace, and you have this group of men who are all wearing clothes matching the model of the palace, discussing where best to put skyscrapers in order to increase the dominance of this palace, which they are so terrified of in the city. These are some more. This is a middle-aged man. I met several of these middle-aged men who were they were normally engineers with ambitions to be architects. And they generally wanted to surround the palace in a pyramid, in a glass pyramid, because they thought that that would be a good way. I literally, this narrative, I kept hearing it over and over again, that you shouldn't destroy the palace, but instead you should hide it in a glass pyramid, because then it will still be allowed to exist, but it will be sort of tamed and controlled and would no longer radiate its evil ideological energy over the city. So this man invited me into his car to show me his pyramid. This is the current version of the Museum of Modern Art. Which is actually no, this is the previous to current version of the Museum of Modern Art. So sorry, I'm talking about these slides slightly out of order, but the point is that I started thinking about these ways in which people in Warsaw conceive of the dominance over the palace, over their own city, beyond the boundaries of the palace, and then I sort of noticed that in public discourse around the palace there was this constant obsession with overcoming the palace complex, and with overcoming the palace's domination over Warsaw. And I sort of, I thought I'd make my own intervention into this discussion. So I came to a public event that the Museum of Modern Art, so this institution, which does not yet exist in its own building, has a temporary building at the moment. And they have every year they have a thing called the Warsaw Under Construction Festival, which is sort of like the Moskowski Urbanistyczny Forum, but like slightly more arty and slightly more interesting, arguably. And they have this thing within the festival where ordinary people of Warsaw could come and present their ideas about how to deal with the city's problems in a public forum. So I decided to come to this. This is near the beginning of my fieldwork. I decided to come to this meeting, which was called the Department of Propositions, and I suggested that the only way that you could deal with the dominance of the Palace of Culture over the cityscape of Warsaw is to succumb to this dominance, and to write a law into the municipal, to pass a municipal law that every substantial new building that is created in Warsaw has to have an element of the Palace of Culture's aesthetic incorporated into it. So rather than constantly attempting to overcome the palace's aesthetic, you just completely surrender to the Palace of Culture and turn Warsaw into a kind of, so just distribute the palace's aesthetic throughout Warsaw. So this is the palace. This is this national stadium, which was being completed at the time for the Euro 2012 football championships, which are going to be held in Warsaw. So this is kind of like very basic. I have no like Photoshop skills, so I just made these very sort of basic slides suggesting that it's okay, you can finish building the stadium, but you have to hang a giant Stalinist candelabra over the chandelier over the roof. Weirdly enough, I've seen that in Moscow in some of in quite a few buildings you have exactly the same chandeliers. So for example, in Leninka, the lamps in the main hall, in the main stairwell, are almost exactly the same, I think, except they only have 2 levels rather than 3 levels. But they're made in the same factory as the palace lamps. This is so this thing here is a building by Danιέλ Libeskиnd, who many of you probably know. When I was in Warsaw doing my PhD research in 2009, 2010, the building hadn't yet been finished. There was a dispute over property ownership of the building, and there was also an economic. There was also the neighbours of the people living in this building were complaining that if the building was to be completed, it would block the sunlight in their rooms. But actually, it's pretty much been revealed that they were basically only complaining because a rival Zastrojczyk had hired them to try to block the investment. But anyway, the construction of the building was eventually completed, but while I was in Warsaw, it was frozen for about 18 months, or I think almost 2 years, while this dispute continued. So my suggestion was that, okay, you can complete this building. So this building had a lot of also patriotic rhetoric built into it. So Danιέλ Libeskиnd was saying that it resembles the Polish eagle, with the crown on the Polish eagle, all this kind of standard Danιέλ Libeskиnd bullshit. So it was turned into a sort of a kind of modern negation of the Palace of Culture. Whereas my suggestion was that, okay, you can build this building, but only if you hang a gigantic picture of Stalin from the front and put the entrance colonnade of the Palace of Culture on the roof. And finally, this was the version of the Museum of Modern Art competition. The competition winning entry by Christian Keretz, who is the Swiss architect. for the Museum of Modern Art, which was at the time the dominant entry, and also construction was going nowhere, and it's still going nowhere. And my suggestion was that, okay, you can complete the construction, but only if you put I mean, people in Warsaw recognize this instantly. This is just an element of this kind of Stalinist crenellation onto the facade of the palace. And so I was very surprised by the response to this idea. Actually, a lot of people treated it as a serious idea, and the newspapers wrote about it, and it was on television, and a lot of people were calling up the TV station and saying, "Who is this idiot from England? Is he why does the city hire these kind of people?" So they thought that I was actually seriously like some sort of consultant hired by the city who's come from England and who's imposing various ideas on Warsaw, and how dare I, as this kind of as this sort of former Pole, make these kinds of suggestions. So a lot of people got the joke, but a lot of people treated it as a very serious idea, and suggested that this was all very outrageous. So in a way, so after this, my research project became very closely associated with this idea, which I called the Palacization of Warsaw. So from this point, the research entered into a kind of public sphere, and I began experimenting with various ways in which to exploit that publicness of the Palace of Culture. So again, I'll skip over loads of stuff here, but I started hosting. I mean, became quite ordinary practice in Warsaw over the years. But I started hosting these meetings called the Archi Blabla, Archi Gadaniny, like gadać in Polish, Archi Blabla. I suppose you could translate it in English, which I invited people from Warsaw to discuss the Palace of Culture, and to sort of discuss some of the ideas that I was having during my research. So, for example, at this meeting, which was the second Archi Blabla, I invited about 20 panelists, I think, and they all were asked to provide 5-minute summaries. No, they were asked to embody the research, to embody the factor which caused which caused the palace complex. So which prevented the palace complex from being overcome. So you had sort of various politicians or journalists or architects who were, so for example, one sort of right-wing architect who was identified with quite a right-wing political party, embodied the mayor of Warsaw and said that that I am embodying the mayor, and she is the person responsible for this palace complex, and we have to get rid of her in order for the palace complex to be overcome. And then it turned out about a week later that he was in fact standing as a candidate in the next mayoral elections. And then you had this bizarre discussion where he was basically saying that the problem with the palace complex is the impotence of decision makers, and he started accusing the mayor of Warsaw, who's a woman, of impotence. And then the press secretary of the mayor obviously wasn't there, but the press secretary stood up and said, actually, that you're the problem, people like you are the problem, and I'll point out to you that impotence is a male problem as opposed to a female problem. And then it turned into this big discussion about penises and impotence and Viagra. Because this guy, this Bielecki, this right-wing architect, claimed that he had discovered the Viagra which would solve legislative impotence. So basically most people sat down, and then you had this bunch of 5 or 6 men who were just talking about, accusing each other of having small penises and talking about Viagra and erections and all these kinds of things. So you had this. So this is actually there were many interesting things about these discussions. But one thing that made me so just as an example of one thing that this discussion alerted me to is which I previously hadn't been aware of. In Warsaw, generally speaking, when people talk about skyscrapers, this idea of the phallicness of a skyscraper often comes up. And I had kind of ignored this idea of phallicness because I also sort of thought, well, this is a sort of rather banal kind of a pop Freudian thing to say, that, you know, to treat, to kind of discuss the sort of gendered aspects of the skyscraper in phallic terms. Whereas actually this discussion made me think that there is something quite sort of substantial to this idea of the palace's phallicness. Just watching this, there's I don't know if anybody's ever read Clifford Geertz's essay on the Balinese cockfight. But you have this in Bali. You have this famous kind of the cockfight is very important. So men kind of compete via their chickens, via their cocks, over sort of influence in their village. And Geertz had this important sort of revelation at one of these cockfights. And in a way, this palace discussion was a kind of Warsaw cockfight. So. I'll come back to this in a second, but the next step after these archiblablas and various other kinds of sort of performative interventions, together with regard to the Palace of Culture, which I won't go into here, the next step, so the final step of the fieldwork, was to conduct the survey. So the survey was very unscientific, because I'm not a sociologist, so I didn't have to do a scientific survey. It was a kind of completely unrigorous survey. It was hosted online by the Museum of Modern Art on their website. And it was advertised by, you know, I was able to advertise it via newspapers and media and stuff. So in the end, even though it was completely unscientific, I had something like 5,600 people filling in the survey, which had 70 questions. So, and I asked demographic questions. So I asked people to answer, to identify whether they were, how old they were, you know, what level of education they had, which newspapers they read, whether they were male, female, or anything else. So there was some level of control over the total and utter unscientific character, but it by no means was a rigorous sociological survey. But in the end, you know, I did gather certain data which responded to some of the ways in which people treated the palace. Most of it corresponded to what I had assumed over the course of my fieldwork, but some of the more interesting data related to this gendered character of the palace complex, among other things. So, for example, both men and women were more likely to like the palace, but men were 3 times more likely to dislike the palace than women were. So men were 3 times more likely to have a problem with the Palace of Culture than women. Interestingly, men were also 2.5 times more likely to think that Warsaw needs a taller skyscraper than the palace than women were, and 3 times more likely to think that the palace has to be demolished than women. And also, you know, the various other categories. But when I raise these statistics at a meeting in Warsaw, everybody, you know, it was very interesting to see the discussion that emerged in response, because obviously the obvious thing to read into it is that men suffer from the palace complex, in particular because they have some sort of inadequacy with regard to their penises when they see the Palace of Culture, and somehow they associate the Palace of Culture with communism and Stalinism is somehow associated with having a big penis, and therefore they don't like the Palace of Culture for that reason. And obviously this is an oversimplification, but it was interesting to observe the discussion which emerged with regard, because this is basically one of my friends who was a sort of feminist philosopher, more or less made this analysis in a sort of joking way in the audience. And then she had a lot of men respond to her saying, no, we are not aggressively disposed. We are very calm. We don't have a problem with the Palace of Culture, and I hate communism and I hate the palace. And you know, so you had this kind of aggression that was somehow triggered by these numbers and by this triangulation, to use a sort of boring term, of a kind of provocative public kind of intervention as well as a survey. So this is, I mean, I use this example of the gender of the palace complex because it's sort of it's more entertaining than many of the other examples that are in this paper. But the idea is here that basically, yeah, so how can you kind of how can you think about experimental ways of combining a kind of old-fashioned way of thinking about anthropology with some other ideas? And I don't know how to go on to the other slide. Do you know how to? Да. В смысле, другая презентация не будет длинная, будет очень быстро. So, да, это... Нет, это this is the one I think. So is that the... So I'm not going to talk really anymore, but so the idea is how can we so this is apparently now only going up and down. Oh no, okay, I see. So it's going to be like this. How can we sort of think about so the point is that in the workshops that we'll be doing, we're going to be trying to think about Moscow and think about Zaryadye and think about other sort of aspects of the architecture and politics of Moscow in a more or less equivalent way. So these are just some images of Zaryadye, which you maybe... Does anybody recognize this this image here? This is from the Eisenstein film Stachka, and this is actually filmed in this famous Dom Karabel, which used to exist in Zaryadye, more or less on the site of the Philharmonic today. There used to be this kind of very famous house, which had a very large kind of working class population, and Eisenstein filmed his film there. As you all know, Zaryadye was demolished between the 30s and 50s, and then it was the stage for all of these grand architectural proposals. This is Narkom Teshprom. This is Leonidov's idea from Narkom Teshprom from 1937. This is Basil Blažený. This is Formin. This is Mielnikov. So basically, the idea is in this workshop will be to go through the 20th century history, the more recent 20th century history of Zaryadye, especially the 21st century history of Zaryadye, and the current ongoing projects in Zaryadye, and to think about, this is the interior of the Hotel Rassia in 1969. And I don't know if anybody remembers this. Probably nobody in this room does, or maybe some people do. But this in 1990 there was a tent city. There was a kind of like a Maidan type scenario outside the Hotel Rassia for 6 months. There was this sort of very chaotic protest city, which was simultaneously a home for homeless people, but it was also a kind of strike protest city against I can't remember what exactly. And then you have the Zaryadye. Oops. So this image is kind of interesting actually, because I used this image just like in my interview for a fellowship, because I thought it expressed more or less what I was trying to say about the relationship between power and Zaryadye. And accidentally, we organized a lecture in London with Charles Renfrew, who was the leader architect from Renfrew, Dostoevsky and Renfrew, designing Zaryadye Park. And I don't know how it happened, but somehow this picture ended up on the poster for the lecture. Because I think I'd shown it to my friend who was the director of Pushkin House in London, and somehow I must have sent it to her, and she put it up as the poster without me knowing. So I was kind of angry with her for a little bit, because then obviously the press people from the Dostoevsky saw this, and they were like, I was on holiday in Greece, and they called me up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, shouting at me in this kind of New York accent, and cancelled the lecture. So sometimes these kinds of experiments are risky, and sometimes they lead to certain kind of access being closed off, but sometimes they lead to certain other kinds of access being opened up. And this is the opening of Zaryadye. I don't know has everyone been to Zaryadye Park already? Yeah. Not everyone. I know that you've been boycotting it. But, the sort of security stuff. These are some bricks. People taking photographs. People sitting in the park. So the idea is to think about how we can think about Zaryadye's place in Moscow today. The idea was that this would be a slideshow. I don't know if anyone's been to the Media Center, to the Vremenia Mashina Vremeni, which is this kind of terrifying, patriotic. A 3D panorama of the history of Zaryadye, the 1941, etc., etc. This is Zaryadye like 2 days before the opening ceremony, So I really don't know how they managed to complete it in time. But this is literally the 7th of September, 2017. Whereas the opening ceremony was on the 9th of September. So this is, I mean, to work for, like, you know, in Poland, they've been trying to build this bloody museum for 20 years. And they haven't even started. Whereas here they finished this park in 2 days. It's really kind of terrifying. This is also the 7th of September. 7th of September. I mean, total not okay. So I simply don't understand this kind of temporality. This, the idea is that also, you probably recognize this fellow here. I've forgotten his name. So this is him in his office with a picture of some rats. You can't really see it in this light, but he showed me this picture and he said, "Это крысы. Очень символично. Очень символично." So apparently these rats symbolize Medvedev in Nushka's presentation. So this idea is to think about Zaryadye as well as a kind of aspect of what's happening in Moscow after Lushkov. So this actual or imagined delushkovizacja Moskwy, which is occurring. Or not occurring, because you have Zaryadye opening at the same time, but also yesterday there was the unveiling of a statue to Kalashnikov. Did anybody see this statue? Designed by the same person who did the Szczerbakov. So you know, what is the delushkovizacja Moskwy? And then you have, of course, these only work. Did anybody go to the Moskovsky Urbanisticki Forum? So did you see this animation? So this doesn't really work unless you're clicking from side to side, but this is one of these presentations where you had Khrushchevki here, and then it was an animation of them being blown up, and replaced by like these horrendous 25-story buildings built by Pik Grupa or Krost or someone. So you literally had like little clouds of smoke exploding of Khrushchevki disappearing into the face of the earth, and then rising in their place. There were these multi-story houses with trees all around them. There's another one. There's a especially tall one. And then, of course, did anybody see this? So what is this?
Flats that were shown to Soviet to demonstrate their like standard flats and built all places of this Khrushchev.
Yes, yeah. And as far as did anybody go inside this complex? So actually, so they have so this is like the city's best possible idea of what the future of Moscow will look like. So after they demolish all the Khrushchevki and remove 1.5 million people from their homes, everybody will have the opportunity to live in these kinds of buildings. And this is the kind of the best possible vision of the future. I mean, I'm sure you will have like many opinions about this. And now in VDNH there's a new one. So they took apart this one because it was temporary, and they built a new one which is permanent, and it's going to be here for the entire time of the renovacja. And the first thing that you see when you walk into the door is this, is the rubbish chute, which has now been turned into a sort of thing. And then of course you have the renovacja. So I mean, you know, in this is actually outside my building. Every day I photograph the changing sort of conceptual art, well, kind of like constructivist artworks. Because the builders they don't really make the plitka into a pavement, but they kind of keep changing the position of the plitka, and they always lay it in these incredibly sort of interesting ways. So you have these kinds of some of them stay the same for many days, for like a week, and suddenly they change and take this one. This one's been like that for I think 2 weeks at the moment. Just sort of. This one is good to see these rocks and these things. So you can find sort of constructivist masterpieces in lots of different places in Moscow. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all the slides. But there's the last one. So I mean, I suppose the idea is here that you can mix sort of. You can try and consciously kind of borrow from some kind of art practice in your ethnographic endeavors, and also in the results of what you produce. But also you can find these kinds of conscious or unconscious artistic experiments or ethnographic experiments in the daily life of the city, and use that to inform your project. So I mean, the Moscow bit was very much a series of questions rather than a series of answers. But it's about thinking about how you can deploy these kinds of methodological experiments in a kind of workshop on contemporary Moscow. So yeah, I don't know if anybody's got any ideas.
We have time for questions.
Yeah. Mm.
Can you describe the term Gesamtkunstwerk in short?
So right. Okay. That's a very sneaky question, because I was precisely going to not talk about Gesamtkunstwerk, and then I accidentally said it, and you picked up on it. How would you describe it?
Actually, I don't know. Is it about gift or versus commodity culture?
Yeah, no. I mean, the term Gesamtkunstwerk comes from opera, so it comes from Wagner. So Wagner, like, this is sort of really good. You could make an opera on the basis of Zariadye, for example, or an opera on the basis of Renovacja, in which case Gesamtkunstwerk suddenly becomes relevant. But the idea is that you have set design, music, acting, all the different spheres of kind of artistic endeavor coming together to form the total opera, the total work of art, which is Gesamtkunstwerk. And as you've probably, the Boris Groys book, which translated into English as the total work of art. I don't know how it's translated into Russian, but the most famous book by Boris Groys from 1992. But it was actually originally written in German, because Groys was already in Germany, and this book was called Gesamtkunstwerk Stalin. Gesamtkunstwerk Stalin. So the idea is that that Groys lays out in that book is that the Moscow conceptual artists completed this Gesamtkunstwerk for Stalin in a way that Stalin never managed to do. And also you had the planners of Warsaw, so people like Edmund Goldsamt, Józef Sigalin, other people who were trying to create this kind of total city on the ruins of this kind of chaotic city of the pre-war era, referring to the notion of the Gesamtkunstwerk in building the post-war metropolis. And I suppose, I don't know if it also came up, but very much the same kind of discourse was used by planners of Moscow in 1935 and in the 1950s when they were building, the new Moscow. So I don't know if does that respond to your question?
Can I ask another one?
Yeah.
What's the influence of common understanding of communism about the Jews issue as in paper here, something like that, in common sense of people, and what the influence on the architecture of the city?
Of communism in general.
Communism, some social events like occupation or something like that. I saw in a paper you showed us some percent about Zidane.
Yeah.
It's I don't really know how it's how strong is the influence of those events now in modern culture here.
Yeah, so I mean, so that's also a very good question, but one that exists on. That's a Gesamtkunstwerk of a question, effectively. But I mean, yes. So like certainly in Warsaw, the presence of the memory of communism is very strong, but also the memory of the war is very strong, and there are very conflicted narratives about the war and about communism. So the current government in Poland is a very right-wing government. It's sort of, they hate Putin, but basically they are the same as Putin, even though they hate him. They are like the Polish anti-Putin Putins who are in control at the moment. And they're basically, you have this they basically hate Germans, Russians, and Jews, and think that only the Poles are the true carriers of the nation. So this kind of narrative connects the Palace of Culture is. I mean, it's difficult to answer this question on all levels, but the point is that the Palace of Culture sits on a section of Warsaw that was completely destroyed, most of which was occupied by the Jewish ghetto. By what became in the 1943, 1941 became the Jewish ghetto of Warsaw, which was a predominantly Jewish area before as well. So many Jews lived in that area of Warsaw. They were murdered. They were taken away from that area of Warsaw, and their memory was sort of wiped away. And the Palace of Culture sits on the top of that memory. So in a way, communism and the Palace of Culture are considered by a lot of people as having wiped away the memory of pre-war Warsaw, of Polish Warsaw, of Jewish Warsaw, of the whole civilization, of the whole culture that existed beforehand. But then as well, a lot of people in Poland identify communism with Jews. So there is this idea. In Polish, the word Żyd, by the way, is not an anti-Semitic word. So Żyd is like Yevrej in Polish, even though I know in Russian it has a whole different meaning. But there is also this idea that there is this anti-Semitic idea of Żydo-komuna. So this idea that communism and Judaism that the communists were all Jews, and that the Jews brought communism upon Poland. And the Palace of Culture is a fascinating building because it contains many of these narratives within it. And the connection, I suppose, between Zariadie and the Palace of Culture is that also Zariadie was a predominantly Jewish area in the 1930s, before the demolition of old Zariadie to make way for Narkom Tiashprom. So there is this, and also I've heard people say to me, or I think I've had this conversation with somebody, and also I was sent a link by some people who are opposed to the park, to Zariadie Park, on the basis that the design ignores the history of old Zariadie, including the Jewish history of old Zariadie. So perhaps, I mean, that doesn't necessarily answer your extremely difficult question. I don't think I'm able to answer it, but maybe there is that link.
May I then continue with
Mhm.
it seems that cultural code is filled in some way with some hatred.
Sorry?
It seems that cultural code is filled with some hatred, I think.
With some rhetoric, with some hatred.
Hatred.
Yeah.
And do you know, maybe until this they will count the storms, these events. Until then, they can't produce some harmonic new architectural decisions.
Yeah. Well, yes, yeah. Sure. I think so, yeah. And I think that's what people, exactly. And that's what people call the palace complex, in a way, that the palace complex is all of that hatred that exists, and all of that sort of over emotional attachment to the past. And certainly people in Poland and people in Warsaw are obsessed with the past. And definitely the palace complex is an element of that. And I don't know whether you think, do you think it's similar in Moscow as well, or do you think it's different?
I don't see it here. There are different kinds of people. Some are with terms with their issues from the past, and some are very filled with some hatred, and they can't come to terms with their past. I think so. Thank you for your answers.
Okay, thank you for the points. They're very thought-provoking.
Thanks, Michal, for a very interesting talk. Well, I have a couple of points. I don't know. Well, regarding Zariadie Park, the way it's renovated, to me, it very much resembles the renovation that is done in other public spaces of Moscow. So I see some kind of continuity with other public spaces and the way that has been, they have been developed in the last couple of years. I don't know if you have anything, any reflections on that, and how generally what is the connections, or how the whole space, how Zariadie is connected to the general, restructuring, that's going on in Moscow. And another question that I have that's more theoretical has to do with the idea of gift and the way that you described it, and the idea of debt as well. And do you see any distinction? Because to me it seemed that the way that you presented gift very much resembles the way that debt, well, functions
Mm-hmm.
symbolically,
Yeah.
but clearly financially. There are many examples. So, yeah, any thoughts on this kind? Good point.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the first point, like, I'm gonna be kind of annoying, and because I'm you know in my fieldwork site now, so I'm the anthropologist, and I actually want to hear more what you and everybody else thinks about the connection between Zaryadye and other sites in Moscow. I think there are loads of connections, but I mean, do you think Zaryadye is a special project? Or do you think Zaryadye is an ordinary project? Special project.
In Russia, of course, special project. Very expensive, very parametric architecture.
Mm-hmm.
It is not ordinary for Russia. And very expensive because our cities not like Moscow. They are very very cool, not good residential areas.
Mm-hmm.
But in Moscow, it's a very rich city,
Yeah.
like other cities in Russia.
Yeah. What was the cost of Zaryadye Park actually? Because I hear different figures. You can Google
You
it.
can see
They
Google.
began with 5 billion, and then it was 14, and then 27.
Was 20?
Nobody knows the real numbers.
So 27 billion rubles.
Yeah.
Is that currently the official figure? Okay, so that's like, yeah, I suppose that's like 400 million dollars or something, isn't it? So, but you think so, and so yeah, exactly. Maybe that's one way of thinking about the. So, in a way, Zaryadye is presented. I mean, the gift debt issue is like, that we can talk about that for like 5 hours. I mean, they're overlapping narratives, and they're almost, But the point is that Zaryadye is also presented as a gift to the people of Moscow. So when Putin came in 2012 with Sergei Sobyanin, and they visited the ruins of old Zaryadye, and and there was this famous televised moment that's written up on the official propaganda material of the park, where Sobyanin said to Putin, "We have to build a beautiful chinovnikov zdania, it's administrative center, and it will be fantastic." And Putin said, "Нет, Сергей Семенович, здесь построим парк для москвичей, от меня, чтобы все было хорошо."
I
Yeah.
think that the realities look like within high in this star. It's like exhibition of rich, of expensive, of beautiful ideas. It's like the happy future of Russian people.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not. It's like fake. I think it's like exhibition. And when I was in the radio, there are so many people. They are happy because it's very beautiful place, but it is not. It is like exhibition of only one side of Russia. It's like the palace on in the city, in the environment.
Yeah.
It's like this building, but it is 21st century place because now it is very popular to reconstruction of public spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's the same. It's the same idea of power, of
Mm-hmm.
reach, of future, and I think that it is not true. Because
What's not true?
because I'm from far east of Russia, and our cities looks like not like Moscow. It is Moscow. It is not Russia.
Yeah. Well, and even Zaryadye is not even Moscow. I mean, Zaryadye is not even Ismailova or Yugozapad
It
or.
looks like the future of our cities, but it is it can be only in Moscow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is also a common narrative here about the fakeness of something. What is in Moscow only, not in Russia.
It's like an exhibition, like VDNH was in the East.
Yeah, and even like VDNH, it has VDNH has the Uzbekistan pavilion and the Armenia pavilion, whereas Zaryadye has tundra and steppe and taiga.
I think that it's like an exhibition of power, of beautiful, very beautiful. I don't remember this word.
Можем по-русски.
Я тоже по-русски. Quintessence of beauty.
Zaryadye to quintessence красоты.
It's like VDNH was in USSR.
Mm-hmm.
Quintessence of reach, of beauty of our life. And when the people from other sides, from other cities was in VDNH, they saw this beauty, this future is so okay. I will be work so hard because it is our life, it is our cities, and there was no in different cities. They saw only VDNH, and so that it is Russia, but it was not true.
Although there is a VDNH in Kiev, there's a VDNH in Minsk. There are like mini VDNHs in various cities in the Soviet Union. I think there's a VDNH there's like 5 or 6 VDNHs at least in various, and in Kiev the one is actually quite similar to the one in Moscow, just slightly smaller.
There's no station expo centers. It's quite popular in different countries. For example, in Dubai for 2020 expo, they actually built now a huge space. So, but the other question: why do people want to harm this park? Vandalize. Why? Почему они хотят его использовать? По сути, там, продукты растения и прочее.
I read that idea that our people not rich and it is not popular for people. It is very expensive, and they saw, oh my God, I want to take it, like dikari.
Yeah.
Why people? Because it is not normal for Russia. And Moscow is touristic cities, and many people from Russia go to Moscow to holidays, and they can see beautiful places. It is not normal, and I think that if it will be normal, it will be okay. It will be like, okay, beautiful flowers. I don't want to take it because I can see it in my home.
But do you think people were really, because I keep wanting to, maybe we should speak Russian. I don't know. We'll carry on in English. There was the people keep talking about how people harmed the park. But like, do you think people really harmed the park, or it's just like you had 300,000 or 400,000 people going to the park, and it was chaos, and so obviously some plants got damaged, and then the response of the park management was like scandal, outrage, like positively they don't know how to act in our park, and they have to be educated to behave properly. Or do you think people were really going and aggressively doing damage to the park because they wanted to harm it? Like, I don't know. Although, to be honest, when I saw the plants, I kind of wanted to take some as well because they looked really cool, and I wanted to have some of those like tundra plants in my house. So maybe there's an element.
There was a Moscow Times article today actually which advanced sort of kind of social resistance theory. That it's actually an unwanted gift, and you basically return it by sabotaging it.
Oh, I see. Was that explicitly the narrative in the Moscow Times? Bloody hell.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist anymore, the Moscow Times, but they're getting more and more sophisticated by the...
Well, online gives you freedom.
Well, yeah. That maybe that's the case. And they had all these cool plants and pot plants, but I don't know if you've been there. So I was there today for the first time in a few days, and they've put up these little fences all around like the taiga, So like up the tundra now has these tiny little strings that are supposed to protect the plants, and there are more guards, and they're even more aggressive. And then because they're supposed on the 1st of October they're supposed to open the park completely for everyone. So do you think this will happen? They're going to take down the Zagroda? No.
Not really, but you know, we had several parts quite greatly renovated during this past several years. Like Ссорин-Чайков, within High, Park Gorko, and there are some new parks. For example, there's good one near the Moscow Choral Synagogue.
Yeah.
And it went quite smooth because the local population there controlled all the process, all the steps, and it was not like a gift from the municipal managers that have like their high authority that they have to give dry statistics to, but just all the process. And it looks really like the place for people because the young and children and stuff like that are there all the time during the night time and mornings. It very greatly contrasts this the radio park that is destroys all the archaeological site over there. It destroys the historical landscape because it's made the plain surface into the hills, and it is breaking of the official law, which is a criminal thing to do. Yes.
What, to make a plain surface into a hill?
Yes. Because this landscape is like it's just governed by the official. Yes, they are strictly saying by the word of the law they are criminals. Yes.
Who the architects? Charles Renfrew, Sergei Kuznetsov.
Yes. Those who put their signatures on this projects and stuff like that.
Sobyanin, Putin, etc.
Yes, because they had to have some commissions that would say no, that is not possible. This archaeological site and this historic landscape that have to be preserved. So I wanted to ask you some a question about the this bizarre Russian-Polish relationship in Warsaw, and how it is. The first thing is between the Warsaw intellectuals this thing discussed or understood that this skyscrapers, Stalin skyscrapers is like the new Hydra's head, because this Orthodox church of Alexander Nevsky was demolished in 1924, and so this Stalinesque Saddam Husseinish figure is just the doppelganger of the King Nikolai II, that the Polish officers and stuff like that.
Katyn, you mean?
Betrayed and their king, And
so,
yes.
Right,
so
I see.
This in the psychoanalytical community mostly, because it all goes to this basic stuff, a thing that we are not only not able to talk about, but even think about or feel about this, this spaces of darkness, and it bursts into this pools, sociological pools, when they give you the answers and then they react aggressively when they see their own answers just in the column. How do you think? It is thought about by the poets.
Well,
understood, or like do they because it's mainly the urban is like always about the sacred.
Yes.
The place we live in, the city, is like always about something that asks the questions why we're here, why what comes next.
That was we're gonna have
mostly
to.
when there are local high buildings like
Yeah.
that mimic the church buildings.
Yeah, that's unbelievably. I haven't. That's an extremely complicated question, and I don't think I can answer it because people do have these discussions, and I think probably there is especially I suppose I think probably among like scholars of culture in Poland, but also in Russia, there's quite a strong influence of like Eliade and like Axis Mundi and these ideas about the sacralization of space and the boundary between the sacral and the non-sacral, and these are psychoanalytically influenced, etc. So people do have, you know, in kind of culturological analyses of the palace, you do have these kinds of ideas appearing. But what was connected to that is the phenomenon, which I have a short article about this, is what happened to the Palace of Culture after the Smolensk catastrophe. So in 2010, the Polish president Lech Kaczyński died in a plane crash in Smolensk when he was on the way to commemorate the victims of the Katyń massacre. And the current Polish government has based its entire existence on the idea that the Kaczyński was killed by Putin and by the previous Polish government working together. So they have invented this sort of rather crazy myth about the murder of the Polish president by Putin, and it took them kind of a long time to create this myth. And interestingly, when the discussion after the death in 2010, after the catastrophe, the whole of Poland was in kind of shock, and there were all these spontaneous demonstrations on the streets, and people kept putting crosses up everywhere because Polish people are really like a lot of Polish people are super Catholic, so there were all these kind of little crosses going up everywhere. But the center of like symbolic demonstration of love and of mourning and of tragedy shifted to the presidential palace. So normally in Poland, when you say palace, it means the Palace of Culture. But at that time, when you said palace, it started to mean the presidential palace. Until the first until there was this is a really long answer, but until there was a suggestion to bury President Kaczyński in the crypt of Wawel next to Piłsudski, who was this kind of national hero of Poland. And then there were big protests against that decision, and the protests were held outside the Palace of Culture. And people were making jokes about hanging the body of Kaczyński from the Palace of Culture. So the Palace of Culture became associated with the kind of negation of this myth. So it became an instrument, partly because of its Soviet associations, with which to break through this kind of Catholic martyrology myth. So I mean, there are these weird counter-sacralizations and also kind of counter-sacralizations that the palace took part in. And now, of course, Poland is led by the identical twin of the person who was killed by Jarosław Kaczyński. But that's a different story.
And
yeah.
how all of this is watched from Krakow?
Yeah, I mean, well, Krakow is where the body is buried.
But there are Austrian Poles, like, and the Russian Poles are like very much different, I think, and they in many ways, and they see this like Warsaw stuff as a bit different.
Krakow, people in Krakow, I mean, this Austrian thing, it's sort of true, but people in like Warsaw and Krakow, people in Krakow are kind of really like they're the most Catholic actually, and they love the Pope, the dead Pope. So actually, people in Krakow tend to be more supportive of the current regime than people in Warsaw do. But that's a whole different. We can talk about that.
But
Yeah.
ran out of the time. The library is closed. So
Okay.
last question. No.
Okay. Well, I have a short question.
Yeah.
gifts, because I think the problem with Soviet gifts was accepting not only building as a material object, but also the program of the building, public building. You had all these, I don't know, sort of libraries, the cinemas that start to spread this sort of culture. Yes, that's the gift, and the way to reciprocate was accepting this program. Yeah. So the question is how close is the original program of building, and it's like sort of fastest persistent in the building. Because I think the idea, this program of the park is also part of the problem. Because what you are supposed to do in this park is to walk with, I don't know, baby, or to like your notebook and the cramming on your background. But it's something that just people who live in the city center could do, yeah, because you won't travel from the sleeping district, I don't know, to just send to spend time in there. And this is a very specific social strata, not the whole Moscow, but just very elite and so on. And it is considered as a gift to specifically these people, yes,
You're right.
Not for
Sure.
Yeah.
To stop them from having another bolotnaya or something. Yeah, I mean, sorry, but in a way, I mean, that's kind of how it's presented, how Zariadye was presented in like when the competition was won by Delius, Scofidio, and Renfrew. It was presented certainly like in British newspapers as a kind of concession to the angry middle class of Moscow, to stop them from. But that's also, I'm sure, that's a simplification of a different kind. But with regard to program, that's a really interesting point, which also links Zariadye and Warsaw. In many ways, because they both have this complex, multi-layered program, but one that's very different. And the interesting thing about the Warsaw Palace is that, as you say, it does continue to fulfill more or less, broadly speaking, most of the same functions that it did when it was built. So it has these libraries, it has universities, it has the Palace of Youth, it has Congress Hall, it has theatres. So it has. There is a reason for a lot of people from Warsaw to come to the palace regularly, and it's not a totally democratic place. So there's no football matches in the Palace of Culture. There's no like zhuzhel, like motor biking. You can't really get that drunk in the Palace of Culture. Although the toilet in the Palace of Culture is the only one that homeless people are allowed to use. But it does continue to fill these. To fulfill these functions. So in a way, it does have this kind of still socialist function in Warsaw's public space, as opposed to the rest of public space, which is becoming very privatized and stratified throughout the rest of the city. Somehow the Palace of Culture resists that privatization of space and stratification of space, which is inherent to the late capitalist city, and that's partly a result of the aesthetic characteristics of the way in which it's entered into the symbolic sphere of the city, and it's the success of the sort of totalizing vision which persists on some levels today, and that's a really interesting. So. In terms of thinking about still socialism as opposed to post-socialism, in terms of thinking about what aspects of our socialist legacy continue to exist today, it's really interesting to compare actually the way in which this happens with the Palace of Culture with the way in which Zariadye Park may or may not end up functioning. Because in a way there is a sort of socialist aspect to Putin gifting the park to the city rather than building a shopping mall or a luxury hotel, although there will be a luxury hotel, but rather than building a commercial retail space, giving a park to the city is a sort of grand gesture, which is almost Soviet in style. But then, yeah, as you say, the program will be probably targeted at a rather elite audience. So yeah, it's. I think perhaps again I really appreciate that, because that's a really interesting way of thinking about the continuity, the way in which continuity and difference of various aspects of socialist project can exist side by side, and that Warsaw Zariadye comparison is interesting there too.
Can I just add, I mean, of course there is two big Soviet parallels. First of all, there's of course Gorky Park, gifted by Stalin to the Soviet people. But then there's also the Soviet tradition of Bulyanie, which actually slightly, that was something where people would come from quite far to go on sort of holiday to when Gorky Street was closed. So this idea of people coming somewhere to walk is actually also a very Soviet continuity.
Yeah, and it's interesting, really, actually, because I was reading an interview with some of the people from Strelka who initially consulted the Zaryadye project before they were removed from it by the city, and they said that actually the difference between Zaryadye and Gorky Park is that it will be a different kind of gulianie. So in Gorky Park, people come from a long way to guliat with their prams for like 4 or 5 hours, whereas they predict that the gulianie of Zaryadye will be like more intense, short gulianie, which will last for a maximum of 2 hours. So again, there is a conscious idea that there is a sort of this is a park for gulianie, but it's like a new hybrid, intense kind of post-Fordist gulianie, which no longer is as relaxed.
There isn't even an English term that really translates gulianie appropriately.
No.
Ambulating, I guess,
Well, yeah.
which is very bizarre. So
Yeah. Well, we can use gulianie and make it into a global term.
You go ahead.
I will. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. И будем, наверное, надеюсь, что будем продолжать этот разговор в воркшопах, которые будет по-русски. Да, будем проводить по-русски. Да, спасибо. Thank you. Sorry, no idea. Я думаю, это сегодня может. Да, можно. Думаешь, да, конечно. Yeah. Are you in the script? No. Sorry? Oh, no, that's not mine. Actually, did I give you the right one? Because I'm giving around this.
Which actually was known in the years of very interesting kind of it was very much but interesting because it was opposite. I guess it was very important. Was very long all the time, and people was very. So that's the travel, as you can see, and work was
А можно я заберу этот две открытки?
Nobody worked.
Ну да, наверное, надо было закончить.